I'm going to try and record this lecture in 10 minutes prior to class. Here we go. Lectures on the 1920s economy. I have two questions. You should be able to explain why the economy was so good in the 20s. You should be able to explain why it fell apart near the end of the decade. Funny thing is, the explanation for the first question is actually a good chunk of the explanation for the second question. The boom of the roaring 20s could not be sustained. The very things that caused it to be so good also caused it to fall apart. What were the reasons why it was a good economy? Number one, there was a boost in production from World War I. Two pieces to this. One is the farm economy just surged during the entire part of World War I, even while we weren't in it, because we were feeding all of Europe, or much of Europe. But also our participation in World War I boosted manufacturing because we had to produce the ships that carried the stuff over, we had to produce a bunch of war material, and supplies and ammunition, etc. There was also a boost in manufacturing productivity, so the same number of workers could produce more due to new techniques. And the main ones there would be kind of the scientific management of production, and I will give you resources to read more about that. And two, but especially the assembly line that Henry Ford had pioneered in earlier decades really came into its own in the 20s. Very importantly, there's a boost in consumption. I'll talk more about that. There are new products, there is the birth of the advertising industry, and there are new ways to buy things without actually paying for them at the time, such as layaway and the beginning of credit. Not so much credit cards, but the beginning of buying things on credit. And very importantly, there is an increase in speculation. We'll talk about that. The downfall is there's overproduction in the 20s. We get really good at producing, and we can consume it for a while, but we can't keep up the consumption. There's a dramatic inequality. Certain classes of society can keep consuming, but the rural areas don't do well, the farm sector doesn't do well, and the working class doesn't keep up, and they cannot continue their consumption, or never are able to. And so the inequality contributes to the downfall of the economy. Consumers buy more than they can and become overextended. Farmers don't do well, and the speculation comes to a halt. The irony, the sad irony of the Great Depression is it was poverty amidst plenty. We didn't have problems because we couldn't produce much. It was we produced more than we could afford to buy, and production had to be slashed. Productivity. In many industries, the idea of Taylorism, excuse me, that we could standardize production, what the humans were doing and what the machines were doing, and cut costs, really comes to, it's gathering steam in the early 1900s and the teens, but it comes to full fruition in the 20s, and the best example of that is Ford's use of the assembly line. It's really in the teens and 20s when it comes into its own, and you can see that in 1908 the cost of a Model T is $850, and we sell 10,000, and years after, the cost to produce it actually drops, and the volume increases by 1 order of magnitude and then 2 orders of magnitude. And that's a process that you're familiar with in the tech industry. Product is introduced and it's very expensive, and then as the volume of production increases, you can actually cut costs. Consumption. There's actually a third industrial revolution. The first, if you recall, and you need to be very clear on these if you need to stop the slideshow and go over it, is in the early 1800s, and it's the one that involves the use of water power and steam power and the beginning of railroads. The second is in the late 1800s. It involves those heavy industries of steel, oil, chemical products, and the huge boom in railroads. And the third of the 20s is the consumer revolution. There's a new middle class arising, excuse me, more urban, lots of new products, and more leisure time. Still a very unequal society. However, an urban middle class is growing, and they can afford to buy things. So how is an urban middle class different, or a middle class different from the working class or the rich? Working class, kind of by definition, is making ends meet. But they don't have any discretionary income. No income to splurge on products that they would like to have, but don't need. How is the middle class different from the rich? The rich have a lot of money and have a lot of discretionary income. The difference is there aren't very many rich people, and so as a group, their impact on the economy is not that great. It's the middle class with some discretionary income, but lots of numbers, that actually has the economic impact. Ask me about that in class if that's not clear. Tons of new products. This is when things that you and I take for granted really become available. Machines that do things for us that we had to do on our own before. In the home, the electric vacuum becomes a deal. The electric iron, as opposed to what? Yeah, an iron that you would heat up on a stove. The refrigerator, I may talk about that a little bit in class. No more ice boxes. Entertainment products come into their own. The phonograph, buying a radio. The film industry is born. And the big one, cars. Cars have a massive impact on American society, but also economically. Vacuum cleaners, there's an electric iron, there is the cold keeper, a new kind of refrigerator, the phonograph. In 1920, the first radio station begins regular programming, station KDKA in Pittsburgh, and radio stations dovetail a new kind of business with purchase of radios. And within the decade, even less than a decade, entertainment and communication is transformed. And this affects people's leisure time, how they are entertained. It affects communication, it affects news, and it affects society in general, which I'll talk about more. Film has a similar dramatic impact. It's just a remarkable spread, and in the 20s, the early films are silent, and then by the late 20s there are talkies. That is Charlie Chaplin, maybe America's greatest actor of all time on the left, in a famous movie called Modern Times, and that is the It Girl, the first It Girl, Clara Bow, on the right. There are some early films of the 20s. Leisure time is also a thing. Most people are still working 5, 6 days a week, but some people even have, the middle class, has time for pleasure and even travel, and that's kind of the birth of the industry. People begin listening to radios. They begin going to movies. Sports, as a spectator thing, really has its birth in the 20s, and travel begins. Babe Ruth, this is his era. Cars, the Model T is the key product of the decade. It affects production. Sorry for the noise upstairs. Henry Ford pays a wage that is $5 a day and more. There's the bell. Let's see if I can wrap this up before you come in. More higher wage than other workers have been paid. And the thing was, he wanted his workers to be able to afford the products. And so the Model T is not a great car, but it is affordable for even the working man on a salary that Ford paid. The car transforms America's mobility. It affects so many aspects of our society. I will save that and talk about that in class. But the move from cities to suburbs, for the ability to travel, and the effect on everybody's behavior. That's a picture of the Tin Lizzie, the Model T, with Henry Ford. That's a picture of New York City with just a mishmash of trains and cars and cable cars and subways underneath. And there's another picture, and I'm going to stop there.